Allora, giusto una cosa organizzativa.
Just an organizational note, as you will have seen from the agenda, we are going to have 3 different parts to our conference. There is a sub-theme, as it were, in each session. The focus, of course, is always schools. Each slot will be moderated by an Indire researcher, and each session features 3 speakers. So I would like to invite the speakers of the first session to take their place. And Giusy will be moderating this first session. Good morning. So I would like to now invite our first group of speakers, Professor Biondi, Professor Pacheco, and Professor Ims. So I'm going to sit down, if you don't mind, since I'm asked to moderate this session. As Samuele said, I am an Indire researcher, and therefore may I say that this event is for us extremely important because it helps us take stock of what we've achieved, and it also enables us to look ahead. We're here as a result of several initiatives that we have carried out in the course of the last few years, and I know that Giovanni Biondi will focus on this issue, and we are also trying to explain what we do to teachers. Generally, we don't deal with colleagues, you see. So we have to understand that when we interact with teachers, we're dealing with people who are doing their best in terms of how to use spaces and improve the delivery of skills. But we know that often teachers are unable to make a difference. Here, on the other hand, we're trying to find common ground and a common language that can be at the heart of our partnership. And may I also add that we have had other opportunities to address this topic. We have already launched a number of initiatives. Back in 2012, we held a meeting entitled When Space Teaches or Educates, Quando lo spazio insegna. And we focused on the use of new technologies, and we saw how school spaces per se are not the whole story. Changing them is not enough if we want to change our schools. We have to understand the importance of space. Space is seen as a third pillar of the education process, of learning mechanisms. So it's the third element, in addition to teachers and students. Unfortunately, one of our speakers was unable to join us, so we will try and define what this third pillar, this third element can provide. And the first speaker, Giovanni Biondi, is going to talk about what we've achieved so far, how we can change classrooms, how we can foster innovative teaching processes. And Dr. Biondi has promoted these initiatives in the course of these years as the president of Indire and in his previous capacity at the ministry. So how can we imagine our future? What is it going to bring? And which dimensions need to be modified for change to occur? And then, what should we start from? Classrooms, physical terms, or teachers? What are the aspects that have to be changed first? And so I will invite Giovanni Biondi to take the floor, thanking you all for your kind attention.
Cominciamo subito a dire che cambiare gli insegnanti è impossibile.
First of all, we should consider that changing teachers, changing educators is impossible. There are so many of them that it would be impossible to change them. So, what is our starting point? Our president said we have 40,000 school buildings. Actually, we have 44,000. A lot of them were built a long time ago, and many more are rented. And they were not meant to be schools. They were designed as warehouses or houses, and then they were adjusted and adopted and became schools. So it is very important to start thinking about renovating these buildings. But these buildings do have common features. Renzo Piano speaks of a civic center, but it is difficult to imagine a civic center made up of floors, corridors, and classrooms, basically. Now, we have to consider when education systems were developed in the mid-1900s, more or less, and the idea was to transform an agricultural society and render it an industrial society. So buildings had to be changed to achieve this objective, and this objective has indeed been achieved because these systems afforded the shift to a new economic model. And here we could reflect on how close the correlation is between certain elements. Just think of Italy, the north and the south. As industry grew, schools developed, whereas in more agricultural regions, education developed more slowly and even lagged behind. We used to have a TV program to promote the literacy and numeracy of Italians, and it wasn't long ago that this program was broadcast on TV. Now, as I said, these systems were developed to convey knowledge. Technical schools relied on training that would allow students to work in different industrial sectors, whereas in an agricultural society, learning occurred simply by watching what other people were doing and through the oral tradition. So I could even say that proverbs were the way through which culture was handed down. So the Taylor industrial model is important here because the conveyance of knowledge occurred through books, through the blackboard, and of course through language, i.e. reading and writing. And what does a teacher do during a lesson? A teacher tries to make things comprehensible, especially the things that students find in textbooks. And then there's remote learning as well, and books are the essential central tool for remote learning. Now, disengaged students in class have to deal with their subjects alone when they go back home to do their homework. Now, here we have this idea of a text that has to be mediated, and this is how schools and classrooms were designed and developed. If we think of a learning space, we imagine a classroom like this one, with one person speaking and all the other people listening. This is something that is fit for the lecture format. But if we imagine a learning space, we have to think in terms of a lab, and even the furniture should look differently. Ever since the beginning of our education system, we used to have a series of shoebox-like classrooms. So basically, there were a series of normal classrooms plus a couple of special rooms or laboratories, corridors, and they made up a school. There were labs with some technological equipment that were used for technical subjects. As I said, the furniture, the furbishing, which I have described in the book I mentioned, well, in the book, there is a whole section dedicated to the history of the typical school, the typical classroom with a desk, chairs, a blackboard, the usual paraphernalia you find in classrooms. But then the blackboard changed and became interactive, but you see that it is still being used as a typical blackboard, meaning that maybe you don't get your clothes dirty with chalk, but basically you're using it in the same way. Now, how can you tell that we are in a school, in a classroom? Well, if you see desks, chairs, books, etc., it means that we are in a school, in a classroom. Now, this architectural structure has remained the same. It hasn't changed. There's a kind of inertia here. And the architectural variants may be different, may change, they may comply with the rules. I was head of a department with responsibilities for school buildings, and I could mention a whole series of facts and figures relating to fire safety rules, for example. I could have mentioned them by heart. But today we have to deal with school architecture and school buildings that has changed a bit, but fundamentally the fundamental structure has remained the same. So here I could show you some photographs. But what is happening today? School is no longer fit for our society. We no longer have an industrial society with an assembly line and with a workplace requiring certain skills. As Jim was saying, soft skills are needed now and different competencies. So we have a knowledge-based economy. Maybe our high schools are very good, but we do not have very good high school students. So we have to consider this disconnect between education and its users, a whole generation of students, an entire society that is acquiring different methods of acquiring knowledge. Knowledge used to be handed down orally, then came the book. But now we have a digital revolution. There's a digital language, and this is having a devastating, a revolutionary impact on society, just as printing revolutionized its age. Now, we see that students are dissatisfied with their schools. They feel they're inadequate to join the workforce. They do not have the necessary skills. And we are right in the middle of this major transformation, and we do not know which way we're going, nor do we know what the future is going to look like. Now, when activities at school change, architecture and school buildings immediately become a sort of a straitjacket. And what can you do? You can move desks and chairs around, but the classroom remains a classroom, and the spaces are unfit for the activities. Now, we have created a space for traditional schooling, for the lecture format, but there is individual learning as well, and usually kids that were unruly were chucked out of the classroom, and all the others were supposed to listen to the teacher and do their homework. This is still the pattern we are dealing with, but new things are emerging. You, as architects, are designing the buildings of the future, and the schools that you're designing now and which will be built in future years are going to be the schools of the future. But 60% of jobs in the future will no longer exist, which means we are preparing people for jobs that no longer exist, and we're still dealing with 18th century teaching and education. This is something that we can infer from the actual architecture of schools. Indire launched an initiative recently involving a number of schools, 550 schools to be precise. And these 550 schools are trying to change this pattern, this system, from the point of view of the way in which they work, of the way in which they conduct their activity, on the basis of learning rather than teaching. So we need new school buildings and new furnishing. It is on this basis that Indire launched a proposal, which is, of course, a starting point to break the ice, as it were, to start designing spaces and furniture in a different way. We call them 4+1. You will find some information about it in your folder and in the book that you received. But these spaces have been designed for a completely different way of teaching. If students come to class not to listen to a lesson, because they can listen to a lesson thanks to cloud computing. So they could come to school because they truly need to interact with the teacher and engage in activities. So we have to reorganize, rearrange spaces, and even the timetable in schools. This is what we need to change if we want to plan our future educational spaces. This is the proposal we are working on, and there are a number of assumptions that we are developing. We want to create something similar to the future classroom lab that was the first experiment to that effect. But we don't want to set up a future classroom lab, but rather a future school lab to turn around entire schools rather than classrooms. And these spaces are instrumental, they are functional for the activities. There must be some space for individual learning, for the school library, because we don't have to necessarily work on digital media. We can still read a book at school. It's not that we want to introduce technology to induce people to read on a screen. What we want to do is enhance learning. You're all architects. You all studied the famous textbook by Argan. So what is the sense of looking at Giotto's work? We can compare his work to all the paintings of the 14th century, but none of us would read Joyce on a computer screen, also because in the end your eyes would hurt. But basically, a book is a way to organize knowledge. It is a sequential system to organize knowledge sequentially. Now, if mankind chose this type of system, it means it is the best. It was the type of system it preferred. Sometimes we think that schools are separate realities, whereas we have to think in terms of labs that are always present in our daily lives. This is why we mentioned the idea of an exploration room. Probably many of these things come from the Fab Lab or those movements that are trying to change the notion of a lab. And if you learn, well, you shouldn't learn alone through the use of a computer, because you really learn in interaction.
La cucina è al centro quindi probabilmente diceva la
Probably
dell'ordine
our president of the Architects Association was saying that we have way too many rules and regulations, and that through rules and regulations, if we comply with rules and regulations, then the project is going to be a good project. As you see, we have a number of tools and structures that have been designed having the various activities in mind, and the lecture style format no longer exists. It still exists, okay, but it is not the only way to convey knowledge. We have a system which is a historical narrative style. We have the literature teacher telling us about Foscolo, then the math teacher teaching us math. But the teaching method is always the same, but as I said, there is this disconnect between what students learn on the internet, being exposed to a variety of modes. Once schools were the only learning places, but the reality is no longer so, and this new reality offers up new opportunities through ICT, through digital languages. These schools, even Mrs. Montessori in the 1920s challenged the typical school. And in our elementary schools, you will hardly find a row of desks and chairs, because now we have moved to the central role of the subject. But again, there is a whole fragmentation of subjects, and teachers are supposed to teach their own subject only. Even the timetable is fragmented, but there are vanguard schools that should revolutionize their timetable. For example, there are some schools that teach only 4 subjects in the first 4 months, because if you want to develop skills, you cannot have lessons that last 50 minutes. So you realize that new teaching methods and even the organization of space are two things that are strictly linked. So an architect, when designing a new school, cannot simply comply with the rules and ensure that it is energy efficient and use the same floor plan. Basically, here we are renovating or refurbishing an outdated type of a school that no longer has a role to play. School, as we know it, will no longer exist. There will be schools, okay, but school Schools will not be organized on the basis of the same tools and roles that we saw in the past. And our children are still attending outdated schools. Thank you.
Mi sembra, ecco, grazie. Grazie anche per la sinteticità, quindi possiamo dire che...
Thank you for this very interesting overview. So the third key player, architecture, that has to serve the interests of education. Therefore, the vision that we can derive from this is one that involves totally revolutionizing schools. Schools have to be entirely renovated, and we have, as I mentioned, looked at the 600.